Hear now these words from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verses 27 through 31, and also 45 through 54. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him, and put a scarlet robe upon him, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat upon him, and they took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, and put his own clothes on him, and led him away to crucify him. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "This man is calling Elijah." And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried again with a loud voice, and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe, and said, "Truly, this is the Son of God." It was a Roman centurion whose unexpected and firm faith moved Jesus to the high commendation, "Truly I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." It was a Roman centurion who is described in the book of Acts as a devout man who feared God, gave alms liberally to the people, and prayed constantly to God. And it was a Roman centurion who glorified God in the moment of Christ's death, with a thrilling confession of faith which stood in dramatic contrast to the blasphemous ridicule of most of the spectators at Calvary, and even to the cringing silence of Jesus' closest followers. Truly, this was the Son of God. May I introduce the 5th character in our Faces of Lent, the Centurion.
Centurion is not a word you use every day, is it? I was the captain of a century, a division of Rome's legions spread throughout the Mediterranean Empire. As you could probably guess, a century had 100 men. We carried out the will of Caesar and enforced the law of Rome. We brought an even-handed justice to the lands that we conquered and ruled. Only those who disobeyed our laws, only those who dared to challenge the will of Caesar needed to fear our power and might. Which brings me to the incident I've been invited here to describe. To be a soldier in the Roman army was a great honor. To be assigned a duty in Palestine, however, left a lot to be desired. None of us liked being sent to the country at the edge of the empire, filled with this strange people, the Jews with their religion, their constant squabbles and frequent uprisings caused no end of trouble. During the week in question, things were even more chaotic than usual. Due to the approaching Passover celebration of the Jews, special soldiers had been detailed to keep order in Jerusalem, and we were supposed to keep an eye on one Jew in particular, a man who'd ridden into town a few days before on a bed of palm branches. Many people had shouted, "Hosanna!" Some had even proclaimed him as the King of the Jews. This man was not a total stranger to me. I'd heard of him. Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth. For the better part of 3 years, he'd been traveling around Palestine, calling sinners to repentance, forgiving the penitent, blessing the children, cheering the discouraged, comforting the bereaved, healing the sick, even raising the dead, according to one rumor. As you can imagine, with a reputation like that, he had begun to gather some rather large crowds around him. This troubled the religious leaders among the Jews. Not only that, but they claimed that he was teaching things that were blasphemous to their God. I could have cared less about that at the time. But they also said that this Jesus was plotting to overthrow Rome. Now that kind of talk was dangerous. So that's where we came in. Us soldiers, I mean. We Romans were in charge. We would tolerate no king but Caesar. And so the order was given. We arrested Jesus in a place called Gethsemane. Some said he'd gone there to pray. Others said he was plotting his uprising. One of his own men led us to him. Now let me tell you something. This man was plotting to overthrow Rome. He certainly was going about it in a peculiar way. I had never seen such a motley, sleepy, disorganized band of followers in my life. One of them feebly tried to resist us by drawing his sword, but Jesus told him to put it away. Jesus himself did not resist us. For the next few hours, the Nazarene bounced around from Annas and Caiaphas to Pilate, Herod, back to Pilate again, I think. It was about 9 o'clock the next morning that I received my fateful orders. Centurion, crucify these men. 2 others were to be crucified with him. Many visitors in Jerusalem would witness the crucifixions, or at least hear about it. My country never missed an opportunity to cast fear into the hearts of our conquered subjects. What with the Passover celebration going on, we had an unusually large potential audience. Therefore, it did not surprise me that I should be asked to oversee a crucifixion on that particular weekend. Centurion, crucify these men. The command was not unusual. Ghastly scenes, brutal assignments were a part of my work. I was a true soldier. As a result of repeated contact with the inhuman, my heart had grown hard, and I was not easily moved by fear and pity. What I did not know was that God can cut through the calluses on a person's heart and touch it where it will respond. That day I was to learn that in a moment, God can frighten the most defiant and bold individuals and remind them that God is still God. Centurion, crucify these men. We were ready with our implements of torture. Crucifixion was a cruel and spectacular method of execution. It was first employed by the people of Carthage and later taken over by the Romans. The outstretched arms of the victim were nailed to a crossbeam. The sharp iron spikes, the lifted mallet, the down... I must not go on. A true picture of crucifixion would cause all of you to shudder, and some of you to get sick. It is little wonder that your gospel writers omitted all except the simplest details from the story. From the beginning, I realized this crucifixion was going to be different than any I had ever conducted. It was, of course, the Nazarene, the one that I later pronounced to be innocent, who made the difference. I had killed many men in my day, all in the line of duty as a loyal soldier of imperial Rome. I always looked upon this part of my job as something to be carried out with as little thought and emotion as possible. I mean, when you put a criminal to death, you couldn't allow yourself to get involved. I was no judge or jury. I was only carrying out orders. Whether Jesus was guilty or innocent was not mine to decide. But this Jesus was different. I could not help but form an opinion about the Nazarene. His very person almost made me feel like I was being judged, not only by my involvement with his death, but by my entire approach to life. Other victims were usually either defiant or cowardly. Jesus was neither. He was calm, almost confident, I'd say. Others were vindictive. Jesus, believe it or not, was kind and even forgiving. Others had often rent the air above Calvary with their shrieks of pain, screaming to the heavens for God's vengeance upon us and their dreadful purple oaths. Jesus was silent. When he finally did speak, in a moment of agonizing pain, it was of all things to pray, not for himself, but for us, his tormentors and his murderers. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That ripped to shreds my matter-of-fact indifference. Have you ever come upon someone who was praying for you and did not know that you could hear? A parent, perhaps, or a child? A friend? Even an enemy? Do you have any idea how I felt? Here was the man that I was killing, and he was praying for me. This was something that was not human. It was divine. Father, forgive them. My men probably didn't even recognize it as a prayer, much less grasp its significance. They'd sat down at the foot of his cross to gamble over his clothes, more interested in the wardrobe of the man they were killing than in the man himself. That morbidly curious mob was so intent on ridiculing him, they probably didn't even hear what he said. That inflamed mob presented a pathetic picture of human nature. When a crowd is aroused, individual decency vanishes. Base instincts and emotions take over. On this particular occasion, they used as their chants and their jeers the themes that had been lifted up before Caiaphas against him earlier. You who would destroy the temple and then build it up again in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, why don't you come on down from that cross? He saved others. Let's watch and see if he can save himself. But throughout the whole ordeal, the noble Jesus remained silent. And then it was God who spoke. The Pharisees and Sadducees had often asked for signs from heaven. Well, now they got them. As noon approached, the sun began to hide its face from this scene of horror. For 3 hours, the mob had been ridiculing the Son of God. For 3 hours, God answered in silent darkness. The mockery stopped. People moved slowly, and they spoke in whispers. It had been a terrible place for us. Now, it was going to get worse. And then Suddenly, Jesus himself pierced the darkness. My God, my God, why have you forsaken me? He asked for a drink, and he received it. He lifted up a word of triumph. It is finished. And then he died, like a child falling asleep in the arms of his father, with one more prayer. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And then there were more signs, not that we should have needed any. The earth began to tremble beneath our feet. Rocks burst. Graves opened. The rich and colorful temple curtain, 60 feet wide, 30 feet high, 4 inches thick, was ripped in two from top to bottom. The darkness had already sobered up the crowd. These added signs impressed upon the people that a terrible crime had been committed on Calvary, and that they had had a part in it. God was speaking with a vengeance, reminding them that God was God and they were only men and women, sinful, little, wretched men and women. I could no longer keep silent. The innocence of his life, the nobility of his patience, the majesty of his suffering, the divinity of his forgiveness, the infinity of his love, the peace of his dying, the triumph of his death, and then all of these other unmistakable signs from heaven compelled me to speak. Certainly, this man was innocent. Truly, this was the Son of God. I'd never studied theology. I had never heard the arguments for his divinity. I knew little of the Jewish faith. Still, there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that Jesus was the Son of God. Later, I learned that my confession was not new. Even before he was born, an angel appeared to his mother and said, "You shall conceive and bear a son. He will become great and will be the Son of the Most High God." At his baptism, a voice from heaven had proclaimed, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And in response to his own question, "Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter had replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Neither was I the last to make that confession. After all these years, millions are still saying it week after week. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. You have probably made that confession more times than you can remember. But I felt what I confessed. Do you mean it when you say it? Or is it just reciting a familiar creed, the content of which has long since been forgotten? Your confession ought to be just as fresh and sincere as mine. Yes, I stood at Jesus' side when he died, but you have the resurrection story. You have 20 centuries of history to support your confession. I can tell some of you have about reached the limit of your tolerance with me this morning. Where does this Roman soldier get off coming in here trying to teach us about our faith? The very idea. The man who literally drove the spikes through Jesus' hands and feet would dare to teach us about the meaning of discipleship? I don't blame you for challenging my right even to appear before you. But if Jesus himself could find it in his heart to forgive me, can not you manage to do the same? Also, have you never heard or maybe even said yourself that by such and such an action you crucify Christ all over again? Those are not just dramatic words, you know. Maybe you didn't drive the nails through his hands and feet or ram the spear into his side, but sometimes your attitudes and actions are such a contradiction to what he taught and lived that at least symbolically you are denying him and crucifying him. There is one other matter I'd like to take up with you before I go. There is no question that you have many advantages over me. The historical witness of the New Testament, 20 centuries of church history and tradition, not to mention the daily presence and power of the risen Christ in your midst. But if I may indulge your attention for just a moment longer, I believe that I possess something that you do not. I know not a one of you would trade the opportunity to live in this great nation with your modern conveniences for the chance to be a Palestinian Jew or a Roman citizen in the first century. But if you could have that experience, if you could have my experience for just one day, I believe you would be a better disciple of Jesus Christ. You know why? Because you would have a better understanding and appreciation of the concept of submission to the will of Christ in your life. Submission, you see, is a military term. If there is one thing I know about, it is submission. It means to place under or come under the reign or rule or authority of another. Not only that, but it means complete and unconditional surrender. It carries with it the idea that the conquered subjects line up under the rule or the authority or the power of the conqueror and submit to the conqueror's direction. But you're uncomfortable with that kind of talk, aren't you? I know your culture has done away, for the most part, with servanthood and slavery, admittedly for some rather legitimate and pious reasons. But at the same time, you have also ruled out the possibility of submission of having any positive value at all. You don't want to be submissive to anyone. You women don't want to be submissive to men. You men don't want to be submissive to women. Children don't want to be submissive to their parents. Blacks don't want to be submissive to whites. Old people don't want to be submissive to young people. Republicans don't want to be submissive to Democrats. I could go on, but I think I've made my point. You are resentful of authority and restraint and discipline. And because you refuse to consider the possibility of submission to God in Jesus Christ as something worthwhile for you to do, you refuse to allow Christ to take control of your life and to rule it as he should. What I understand, and what you need to understand better, is submission to Christ's rule in your life does not mean the total destruction of your will, but it does mean that you allow him to take your will and make it his will. When you come to a healthier understanding of submission to Christ's rule in your life, you realize something. You realize that you are not your own. You have been bought with a price. The price of that cross. You are his purchased possession, and he charts your course. He is Lord, and you are his servant. He is master, and you are his subject. This is not a democracy. This is a monarchy. You serve a king. If you would come to a greater appreciation of the concept of submission to Christ's will in your life, you would realize that it means not only loyalty, but also that you are willing to concede and cooperate. Sometimes that may mean surrendering your own preferences and esteeming others more highly than you do yourself. Sometimes that may mean setting aside your personal interests to serve another. Sometimes it may mean bearing another's burden. It does not bother me that you may not remember all of the details about my feelings and my experiences surrounding the crucifixion of Christ, who truly was and is the Son of God. But if, as a result of my visit, you are not more submissive to the will of Christ in your life, that will bother me, because that is all that matters. When you pray, thy will be done, that's what you're saying. May thy will be done in me. That is what you are praying. That's what you're praying.